The 2019 movie adaptation of Pet Sematary isn't a strict retelling of the original King story. And while I initially found the changes and detours to be detrimental when I first saw the movie upon its release, after watching the movie again, I found it to be a more worthy, enjoyable interpretation than I had remembered, regardless of, and to some extent because of, its refusal to strictly adhere to King's original story. Hi there, I'm your host, Mr. Doyle, and this is a great undertaking. This is the fourth and, for the time being, final video in the Pet Sematary series. The series began with the 1983 novel, followed by the original 1989 film adaptation. Then there was, of course, the 1992 sequel movie, Pet Sematary 2, and that brings us to the topic of discussion today, the 2019 movie remake. While my initial goal was to not compare this movie to the book or the original film and see if it held up on its own, it was the changes they made to the screenplay that gave this movie some perhaps not added but different depth and meaning. So in this video, I want to discuss the changes the 2019 movie makes and what those changes meant in regards to the overall themes of the story. But before we get into that, let's take a look at how the film itself came to be, who was involved, and how they did on a technical level. History and background. Discussions of this remake began as far back as 2010, and in the years that followed, the screenwriters, directors, and producers had all been replaced by the time filming began. This near-decade-long process of hiring and firing is typical of just about every King screen adaptation, but when the dust settled, it was directors Kevin Kolsch and Dennis Widmyer who would ultimately take the reins. Kevin Kolsch had previously directed and worked on films like Starry Eyes, Holidays, and the Scream TV series, none of which I have ever seen or was even aware of. Turns out, Dennis Widmyer's filmography is identical to Kevin Kolsch's. The two are apparently a team who exclusively work together on pretty much everything they do. It seems the directorial duo had some more underground success with success with Starry Eyes, their 2014 debut, which was nominated for and won a handful of less prestigious awards. But as far as mainstream major studio movies go, Pet Sematary was their first foray. The movie was filmed in Canada and had a budget of $21 million and grossed $113 million at the box office. So while it wasn't a blockbuster success, the movie did well enough. Critics at the time of the release were not exactly enthusiastic about the movie, but the reviews weren't all bad. The film currently holds a 57% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes and a score of 57 out of 100 on Metacritic. So I wouldn't say the movie has gained a overwhelming fan base or anything in the 3 years since its release in April of 2019. The cast is comprised of competent, reputable actors, including Jason Clarke and Amy Seimetz as Lewis and Rachel Creed, John Lithgow as Judd Crandall, and young actress Jeet Lawrence. Jeet as Ellie Creed. I felt they all delivered pretty decent performances, even if I wasn't completely blown away. John Lithgow does a great job as Judd Crandall. While he doesn't speak with the requisite thick northern New England drawl, his emotional range and delivery is reliably above average. Honestly, his portrayal being less caricaturish of a New Englander likely gave his performance a more genuine, natural feel, but Fred Gwynne's Judd Crandall is a hard act to follow. Aside from a number of cheap but no less effective jump scares, I felt the imagery, special effects, vibe, and tone were fairly consistent throughout. The makeup, gore, and special effects work overall is excellent, and the score, while by no means groundbreaking, was effective and appropriately sinister. Them changes. In order to discuss what makes this movie different from the book and the first film adaptation, I'll have to go into specifics to some extent. If you've read the book and seen the original movie and you go into this movie thinking you already know what's going to happen, you'd be sorely mistaken. While the basis of the story remains intact, there are some changes made in the 2019 movie that have an effect on the message and also provide some surprises for anyone who goes in thinking they know what to expect. While there were indeed some more arbitrary changes made, there were some substantial, consequential changes made from the original story as well. And these changes have a different perspective and depth to the main topic of the story, that topic being the nature and impact of death. Unlike the novel and the first movie adaptation, this movie focuses more on Lewis and Rachel's conflicting beliefs in regards to spiritual and religious matters and how they pertain to death, rather than how to approach the subject of death itself with their daughter being the subject of contention. It's the argument about what happens after death and what to tell their daughter that the couple doesn't agree on. There's an ideological rift between Louis Creed and his wife Rachel. Louis is a man of science who doesn't believe in an afterlife. He believes that when you die beyond decomposition, there is nothing that awaits you. He finds the very concept of a soul ascending to heaven to be absurd. He believes the only thing awaiting the dead is a box buried in the ground. Rachel, on the other hand, at least wants to believe that there is more to death than the cellular breakdown of the physical self. Like many more spiritual or religious folks, it gives her comfort believing that death is not the end, and she resents Lewis for his outright dismissal of the very idea of an afterlife and of a soul, and her need to believe in heaven and an afterlife stems from the childhood trauma she experienced regarding her sister Zelda. By the end of the movie, she finds that there is indeed life after death, only it turns out that in this instance, she finds Lewis's concept that death is a black void of nothingness, a state of unbeing, far more appealing than what actually comes to fruition. That being said, Lewis discovers that his notions of the spirit world were even further off base than Rachel's. This ideological conflict playing a more pronounced role in the themes of the movie adaptation was not an unwelcome shift, and it added some depth to the relationship of Lewis and Rachel, as well as another layer to the exploration of the complicated conversations and ideological differences surrounding death. Additionally, when Rachel flashes back to the death of her sister Zelda when she is a child, it is depicted as a more sudden, unexpected, and climactic portrayal of death. Whereas in the novel and original film, Zelda's death was more a gradual, prolonged process of dying. Rachel is portrayed as being somewhat responsible for her sister's death, which makes it harder for her to come to terms with. Rather than her sister's death being caused by her disease, it's something that Rachel chose to do that resulted in her sister's accidental death, and so Rachel is understandably haunted by the memory and seemingly haunted by her sister's ghost. And it is this accident, this feeling of responsibility that causes Rachel to need to believe that there is something better awaiting the dead, that her sister's death was for the best. She needs to believe she is in a better place, if only to absolve herself of the responsibility she feels. The biggest change the movie made from the book and original movie that also plays on this idea of blame and responsibility, and this is the big spoiler, is that 9-year-old Ellie Creed and not Gage, her 2-year-old brother, gets taken out by a speeding truck and is then brought back to life. The movie even gives us the impression that Gage is about to get hit and then subverts our expectations with the truck careening into Ellie instead. Also, and this is just a brief aside, I always had a hard time believing that Gage, a 2-year-old, would be able to do any harm or be at all intimidating or formidable after returning from the grave. I find the idea of a murdery, zombified 9-year-old at least somewhat convincing, more so than a tiny knee-high 2-year-old anyway, but that's all beside the point. Much in the same way that Rachel feels responsible for her sister's death, Lewis blames himself, and he is inadvertently responsible for Ellie's death. It is Lewis's decision to resurrect Church the Cat that indirectly leads to the death of his daughter Ellie. It is Church the Cat who, rather purposely or unknowingly, lures Ellie out into the road where she is run down. Had Lewis not brought him back, Ellie would still be alive. And so, like Rachel, Lewis now blames himself for this death of someone so near and dear. He, like Rachel, now knows the burden of this knowledge that there is a straight line drawn between something he has done and this terrible accident that has occurred. And it's having to live with that knowledge that likely solidified his resolve in regards to what he must do, a sort of redemption in bringing back his daughter after blaming himself for her death. He must abandon his previous belief that no afterlife exists and put all his faith in a spiritual plane that until recently he was convinced was a fairy tale of sorts. When I put myself in Lewis's shoes as well as Rachel's, and I sit with the thought of not only losing someone close to me to a tragic accident, but blaming myself for what happened to them, knowing that I am at least in part responsible, particularly the case of Lewis and his daughter Ellie, that's something that just thinking about makes my heart sink and my guts roil. I feel that near physical internal shudder of pain and loss throughout my entire being, and I know that in my desperation, struggling to go on living with the consequences of my own making, it would lead me down the darkest of paths. I would likely do anything to redeem myself, to unburden myself of that horrible knowledge of my guilt, to bring my daughter back, to perhaps save my own soul and just maybe rescue my daughter's. While in the original we know Lewis does blame himself for what happens to Gage, he is not directly at fault for what happens, but in the 2019 film, what happens to his daughter is undeniably a result of his actions, regardless of his intent. There is a deep self-loathing and self-hatred that Lewis is left to endure, and he does what he believes can mend himself and his daughter, and under the circumstances, knowing what Lewis knows, I can imagine the allure of the black powers deep within the Ludlow forest being hard to resist. His entire belief system is destroyed in short order, and he comes to find that he will do whatever it takes, regardless of what he once believed, to salvage his family and to salvage his willingness to live. Final thoughts. I definitely had a hard time enjoying this movie 3 years ago. I wanted a strict retelling of the classic King story. But I'm finding more often than not that when a movie uses the source material as its foundation and tries something a little different, it can expose some new and insightful angles that were hiding just below the surface all along. This time around, I was purposely less critical in regards to the adherence to the original, and as a result, I enjoyed the movie more than I originally had. It's not a perfect movie by any means, but I don't think it's fair to say it's not good just because it's not precisely loyal to the original story. All right, that's it for the Pet Sematary series, for now at least. It appears that there is a Pet Sematary prequel in production currently that will explore the lore of Ludlow, the history of the town's doomed relationship with the Mi'kmaq burial grounds, and is also rumored to feature young actor Jackson White as the young Judd Crandall. The film will be released as a Paramount Plus exclusive, and as of now, does not have a release date, but this sounds like a cool premise. After how good Chapelwaite was, I will allow myself to be just a little optimistic for the Pet Sematary prequel, but just a little. Next week, I'll be diving into the 1984 novel The Talisman, which was a collaborative effort between Stephen King and Peter Straub, as well as the incomplete comic book interpretation of the story. The Talisman is a multi-dimensional fantasy story, which is totally not my thing, but that's not to say I didn't find some enjoyment in the story and in the comic book as well. New videos drop on this channel every Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, so obey your thirst and click the subscriber bell so you get notifications. Okay, goodbye. Be sure to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King, pretty pleased with blood and guts on top. My name is Mr. Doyle, and this has been a great undertaking.